Welcome to the July 2023 Business Insights online network interview. This month, Pete Allison will be chairing a Q&A debate about equality, diversity and inclusion with Nikki Marshall and Sharon Critchlow of Discover Your Bounce. So over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Guy. Yes, lovely. And Nikki and Sharon and Discover Your Bounce we've been working with for quite a few years now in working around areas to do with how people and business relate to each other. And that covers quite a wide gambit of things, from mental health through EDI through any number of other things. We recently were in the University of Bath School of Management with the Bath and North East Somerset Business Show. And we did, as we have done for the last number of shows, ran an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Forum, which Sharon very kindly chaired for us. And over recent shows, as ever with these things, these conversations evolve, they move on, they shape, people have thoughts, they think those thoughts, and they come back with new thoughts. And actually it's inspired an as yet unhad conversation between us internally as a team that says, so where's this conversation going? What do the future of these forums and these discussions about equality, diversity and inclusion look like now that we've kind of put the first spades in the ground and we've got some people actually engaged in the conversation? Where does this conversation actually go? Because it's all very well having the conversation with loads of people who are engaged in the conversation anyway, but actually obviously the objective is to also see some outcomes and make differences. So when we roll these things out, how do we do this? Where do we go from there? So we kind of got as far as saying, yes, we must have that conversation. And then we were thinking, so what was our interview going to be for July's Business Insights? We thought, well, we could rehearse that conversation. It would be a really helpful thing for us to do in-house, whatever else happens. And it might be quite an interesting discussion to have online. So this discussion isn't necessarily going to be about EDI items themselves. It's more going to be about what that landscape's looking like and where it's going. So first of all, before we rattle on, let me invite Sharon and then Nikki just to reintroduce yourselves, but now in context of where we're going for the next half hour or so. Sharon, over to you.
Okay, so I'm Sharon Critchlow, and I've chaired quite a few forums, particularly not just for the business show, but for other entities as well around this area. And it's quite, I suppose it's quite interesting because depending on who you get on the forum will depend on which way the forum goes, because it will depend on what people have noticed. But I think there's certainly been some changes in the last, so definitely within the last 10 years, but actually within the last 2 or 3 years that have been quite big and quite changing for how we do business. Brilliant.
Nikki, just set yourself in context for the conversation.
Yes, so I've hosted some of the other panel discussions at the business shows over recent months, particularly around mental health. And again, when there are people of from different genders, different backgrounds, then there is always a mental health element to some of the struggles that they encounter, and neurodiversity. So being recently diagnosed with ADHD myself and also a stroke recoverer, I can look at the disability and the neurodiversity kind of angle in a lot more detail. And it's just been really interesting looking at these discussions from, like you said, different angles and raising the conversation and just being really open and curious about how we can move forward in these areas.
Brilliant. And I think from my perspective, one of the things that made me realize just how wide and interconnected all this is we also run some work around immigration, migrant workers and migrant cultures in business. And of course, that has inclusion at its heart. And when we started thinking about this conversation and this event, of course, Business Insights, which always manages to have an interesting introduction with Albert with us today from Jordan and Ghana, respectively, who come from very, very different cultural places to the one we instantly think about in the southwest of England when we're running these shows. We'll have time for questions and some ideas as we go along the way, but those parallel and external insights are always really valuable. So let me just lob the first question out, and we'll try and give you both a chance to have a crack at each of the questions. So the first thing that came to me is that over the last decade of this discussion and as we've been doing it, the understanding of EDI has changed beyond recognition. If you go back a decade, that whole LGBTQT whatever discussion, it was possibly not non-existent, but it's certainly embryonic. We weren't so focused on migrants and immigration workers. We did come from a culture that you can bed back to the Windrush generation in the 50s, where you had this integrated culture in the UK. You were looking at quite some right-wing racist issues going on and around sport and what have you. Business culture, I would suggest, and I'm going to be corrected if appropriate from you guys, would have been quite formulaic in white and male, and So I'm interested to just set the scene for each of you to say, well, if you look back over the last decade, possibly longer, whatever the right timetable is, how's this conversation moved along, and how's it got to the place it is now? Nikki, do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think 10 years ago, well, we wouldn't have been having this Zoom call, but we certainly wouldn't be networking with people from Ghana and Jordan, for example. So I think, the advent of the internet and the growth of tech has enabled so many more conversations and so much more understanding about different cultures, different countries, and the kind of, I suppose, the talents and the skills that are brought in. I went to a predominantly white girls' school in the West Country, and I would say that during my school years I had a very narrow view of the world, and the people I network with, the places I travel, oh my goodness, I've learned so much about cultures and differences and also similarities. And so I think it's been great that we've been able to have this conversation. But also I think sometimes we focused on, okay, we need to really focus on women and gender balance. Okay, now we need to focus on the LGBTQ plus community. Now we need to focus on, the diversity issue and, look at, race. And then there's the ageist debate. Like I think we kind of put lots of things in boxes, and I think now those boxes are widening, and actually we're looking at how can we be kind, how can we be inclusive, how can we take away any form of bias. And so I think there's a bit more of a wider conversation rather than things in boxes, but with all of these things I am very open to the fact that there could be different opinions and different views on that. But isn't it great that we can have these conversations?
Absolutely it is. And Sharon, obviously what you've not said, unless I missed it, no apologies if I have, is that your background of your career and profession is that actually you're an accountant working on a global scale with an organization with global membership. So you're going to have a perspective on this, which is Indeed. Not just focused in the UK. Sharon, what do you make of that?
Yeah, so if we just focus on that a little bit. So I started my career in the 1990s. And it was the profession, the accountancy profession, was a very male-dominated place. When I was taking my exams, maybe 20% of the people in the exam hall were female. And since then, I can say in the profession we are now 50-50. Actually, we're probably about 55% female. And so there's been a huge shift in the professions. It's not just accountancy. We've noticed it in law and in lots of others as well, where the actual education in Western women has improved dramatically since probably the mid to late 1980s. There's been more exam entries and more, more women taking degrees. So we're taking a very different position now. But at the start of my career, that wasn't the case. And it was a very male-dominated environment. And when you look at businesses now, even small, there's a lot more women in business for a start. It is a very different landscape. What I always think is quite an interesting way to look at minority groups and minority groups that may need support or aren't being heard is that if you include women in that group, which we have been, I think, for a long time, and you include immigrants, and you include people with neurodiversities and other support needs, and you include, by the time you've included everybody, we're actually a majority. And yet because we're fractionalized into smaller groups, we don't behave like a majority. So it's everybody, and so I think until recently has had to fight their own corner. Where I would say that things have changed is that we've all heard about environmental concerns, and that there's more legislation coming out around how businesses, perhaps not on a micro level yet, but on how mid-sized businesses and larger businesses are being measured on environmental performance, as it were, moving forward. And of course, for big businesses, there's a concern about greenwashing, so overemphasizing their environmental credentials. This is part of a wider thing called ESG, so environmental social governance. The S in ESG is starting to be spoken about as well now. So that is all about how you treat people, whether that's your customers, your stakeholders, your staff, your supply chain, whatever. And in fact, it said I do some work with our accountancy body. I'm very grateful to be a council member, so I sit on the strategic board of ACCA. And what some of the work that we've been doing recently is about talent trends, so what the next generation are looking for in the workplace, and also what and actually well-being is a massive, work-life balance and well-being is a massive feature of that. So anybody looking to take on an under 25-year-old, just bear this in mind, that this is the trend, and it's not just UK, this is global. That's the first thing. The second thing is to actually try and work out, if you like, as business leaders, what is it that businesses need from this S bit of it, to try and define it a bit. And looking at how people are treated throughout your value chain is something that is coming more and more into the front. So I think this ESG kind of project, if you like, this sort of is a galvanizing of all of these different strands that Nikki was saying about, that where everyone's had to fight their own corner. I think this is now a coming together, because it doesn't matter whether you're prejudicing against people on the basis of race, colour, gender, or anything else. The reality is that, as I've said many times, your employees, chances are in this day and age, they're also your customers, and they're also possibly even your investors, the way that the world has now moved on. And you cannot lie to one group and hope that the rest won't notice. So you can't say we're a great company to work for and say that to your stakeholders if it goes out on Glassdoor that actually are not.
No, and I get that. And so we've mentioned in that a lot of different things. I mean, you talked about neurodiversity, you talked about Asian, Nikki did, you talked about all the classic things we know. They don't all change in our awareness and our thinking at the same pace. So I think just, again, a little bit of setting the scene, but also beginning to look to where this is going. In that decade that we've been looking at, what are the things that have been coming to the fore? What are the things that actually have been maybe not worrying us so much? And as we move through 2023, where's that going? What's becoming the really important stuff? And what is it that I'm not going to go as far as saying we've solved things, because I think that would be a big rash statement. But what are the things that we're a little bit more comfortable with versus the things that are going to be really big challenges?
Shall I start?
Yeah, sorry, I should have prompted one of you there. It's always terrible on Zoom, isn't it? We all talk each over. Nikki, you go first.
Yeah, I think in some areas, I think we're making great strides forward. And I think having those discussions, defining kind of what do I mean? Like policies, procedures, looking at how we do business. I think quite a lot has changed. But then you look at those individual areas and you talk to people, and they will say that in reality, some things haven't changed. So, for example, in the last week, I've been discriminated for my gender and discriminated for my age. And, here we are in 2023. And I remember saying to someone, we're not still in 1980. Like, you can't do that. And as a 53-year-old postmenopausal woman, I'm more than capable of kind of calling someone out and saying, actually, that's not the way you treat me here. But there are a lot of people that don't find that as easy. And I think, changing our culture so that we think about inclusion, someone shouldn't say that, they shouldn't have to say, I want to be included here. We should be making provision to make sure that they are included. So with our culture, with our language, with our operating, day-to-day procedures, we need to think about that more inclusivity. And I think, the Pride this month has been all about allies. And so I think years ago, we may not have spoken out for someone who was being discriminated against. I think more so as we go forward, it's our duty to stand with someone and say that's not okay. And as Sharon said, we've seen it in the younger generation. If there's not a wellbeing policy in place, they probably won't come and work for you. But also, if you don't run an inclusive culture, then your stakeholders, your customers, your suppliers, people will stop spending their money with you. So it's it would be lovely if people did it just because they chose to, but I think financially companies will lose out if they don't going forward.
So I'm taking from that sort of the combination of mental health engagement across the EDI piece, which obviously mental health in broadly becomes very important at the moment, but also stakeholder engagement as you go up the decision-making chain. Sharon, what's your take on that as well?
So I think Nikki's right. There are changes on that, and there are implications actually for because you might think, well, you know, I'm a smaller business. Is this really going to impact me? But you could well find that you want to do business with a bigger business, and they're going to be asking you what your policy is on this, and you have to have an answer for that, and you've got to be prepared to answer in some depth on that. And if you haven't even thought about it, that's going to be a lot of paperwork and a lot of soul searching, a lot of digging to try and work out where you are. So I'd say that's the first thing. Then I'd say is that there's been a lot of normalizing of things, which, again, thankfully in this area where we've looked at it, we kind of get it, a bit like, as Nikki said, Pride Month. You know, there's been Pride marches. You go back 20 years, that was a militant thing to be doing, and now it's something that teenagers go to because it's fun. You know, it's the whole landscape of this is different. Of how you look at this is different, but we've still got some areas where we're not really paying attention, or we kind of don't want to. And something that's come out of some of the debates that we've been running recently, ageism is a big one, and of course the whole ageist thing has been sort of put forward as well by the government quite recently, in that they're trying to get people in their 50s and 60s back to work because we're running out of skilled workers, but they don't feel welcome. So where do you go with that? If you haven't got a flexible working arrangement, and I've seen it in my own friendship groups, people saying, I can't physically do this job 40, 50, 60 hours a week. You know, one of my friends is an excellent counsellor, but the charity that was looking to take her on, it was going to have to be working weekends, evenings, shifts, everything. She's like, I can't do it. I can't do it anymore. So if you're not flexible enough to actually accommodate this, then you will lose some of the access to that talent. So ageism's a big one. We were also talking, Jill was on the debate, we were also talking about digital inclusion. Digital is a great thing for a lot of businesses, especially small businesses, but have a think about how your customer's going to find you, how they're going to interact with you. These are things that we're not really talking about in the same way as we do other people's rights, where there's big banner headlines on it. There are no big banner headlines saying, my grandmother doesn't want to drive her car into certain car parks because she can't fathom out how to use an app on her phone to pay for parking. Yeah, these aren't headlines, but they should be.
Yeah. No, yes, absolutely. Nikki said something a moment ago which plays into all that. A lot of this stuff there's a lot of normalization going on, and actually driving that into mainstream discussion and thinking. Normalization can bring with it complacency as well. Mm-hmm. So I think coming back to this thing, obviously you've been managing for us these discussions at the live shows that have been evolving their way through the last few shows. Thinking about that thread of normalizing some things as we get them out the open, the complacency that can come with it, getting the stakeholder engagement to make the decisions actually mean something. How do you see those discussions, certainly that you're running in our world, but I'm aware you're running them in a much bigger space than our world. How do you see those discussions evolving, and with whom and with what tools to actually drive an outcome from something that is a great discussion, but is in danger of just becoming a great discussion? Sharon, you carry on with that one.
So what I think is that the lower down generations, if you like, so the younger people in our society are having these discussions in different places to where we hang out. So where the over 40s hang out is not where the under 40s hang out. And you get some people with a foot in both camps, but it's very rare. So what's happening is that these discussions are happening amongst our age group in forums like this. And if you have a look round, where is our 20-somethings? And in fact, where are our 20-somethings? They're having these discussions elsewhere. And unless we can reach over to them and actually find out what sort of environments they want and what their experience currently is, I don't think we're ever going to make any difference in a meaningful way. Now, amongst the generations that are on our forums and in this environment, the difference we can make is possibly because especially in larger organizations, maybe we're further up the tree, is that maybe we can get more people to think and change attitudes, change policies, and open a few more doors. Look at who you're mentoring, look at whether people are coming through appropriately or not, what's standing in their way, ask those questions, because they're kind of answering those questions online in other places, but I don't think we're looking in the right place for those answers necessarily. And so we need to be able to cover more ground.
Yeah,
I would say, to have a meaningful,
so
ongoing, changing conversation.
We're falling into a trap we see in a number of places where, as decision takers and the older generations around us, we're trying to look at a subject that affects young people through the lens of our life experience and age. And actually young people come at it from a different lens. And how we resolve that, because how do we put ourselves in the place to understand it from their lens, except through looking at through ours, because we are who we are. So it's a really interesting thing about stakeholder and decision takers meeting people, joining a company, joining a profession at a junior level. Nikki, you've got a chance. Go on, have a crack at what do you see about that as well, evolving going forward?
No, well, I think I think actually what we're doing with the county shows, hosting some of the shows at universities, I had a lovely postgrad student on our neurodiversity discussion. So I think having those discussions in the universities is a great start. I think when we have those discussions, making sure we have those larger employers that can send along people of different ages, but also different job titles. So kind of, getting the company view on what's happening. But also, I think drilling down. So some of our discussions used to be, what is good mental health? And, how can we change our language to take the bias out of those conversations? I think what we're doing now is drilling down into those everyday scenarios, looking at real situations and how we can deal with that. I know when we do our emotional intelligence workshops, they give people a way of communicating. And so they can say, that's not okay, but this is how I would like to be treated. Whereas a lot of people years ago would put up for so long and then they would just leave. And actually, with the workforce the way it is, we can't afford for people to leave. It takes so long for us to get the people in the first place. We need to have those discussions. So as an employee, but also as a mid-manager or the CEO, wherever you are, you've got to learn how to have those open discussions, because this is how we do things around here. And if you don't like it, you can go. That's not going to be very good if you're struggling to recruit. So I think we're sort of drilling down into that. And just to say, I'm really sorry, but I do have...
I was going to say, I'm aware you're on a tight time limit, but so you duck out is when you need to, if that's now. Sharon and I will carry on for a little bit, and then we'll just do a bit of a Q&A thing as well. But Nikki, thanks so much for your input. If you've got to disappear, feel free to.
Yeah, lovely to meet everyone.
Thanks, Nikki. So Sharon, we see this overlap in different areas with migration and immigration. We think about disability in the worksheet. Disability, we think about ageism. How, as we look forward into those areas and how they integrate into our business culture, do you see that moving forward? Do you see an effective place? And how do you see those things, businesses, to be fully embracing of some of these issues? Businesses are going to be really quite different places to maybe the business places we're used to now. How do you see that working?
Sorry, my internet's cutting in and out a little bit, so I'm not catching all of it. But what I think is the thing for businesses moving forward is to start thinking about people as people and stop thinking about people as boxes. So at the moment, there's been a tendency to try and bridge the gap, if you like, is to try and make sure that you're, for example, if you're recruiting, is to make sure that you have a representative subgroup of the people who've applied, so that you're actually giving an equal opportunity across all groups, relevant groups that you don't already have perhaps around a board. But I think it goes beyond that. I think we've got to start to seriously look at the cultures of how we treat each other. One of the questions that came up at just as our culture, if you like, in the UK, one of the questions that's come up a couple of times, and people almost don't want to we don't know where to start having this conversation because we can't believe we're still having this conversation, is actually around race.
Yeah.
So even, you know, things which you like, are we still having this conversation? Yeah, we're still having this conversation. And when you think in the UK, we had legislation back in the 1970s to stop discriminating on the basis of race and to stop discriminating on the basis of gender. And actually, do you know what? We're still having the conversation because it's like people didn't want to let it go.
And there's a whole
to actually adopt this and breathe life into it. There's a bit of a mental block as a nation as to what we really, really, really want to do. And I think some of that's down to fear, because it's almost like, well, if I let too many people in, then where does that leave me? You know, it's a fear of loss. But it's just very interesting, I think, that we're having to have these conversations. And I think that there's work needs to be done on a personal individual level and on a governmental level as to why it is that individuals still feel that they've got to only, if you like, only deal with people that look like them. Because why is it got to do what you look like?
That's opening up some really interesting stuff, which we don't have necessarily a lot of time for right now. And it goes into different areas. I mean, as you were talking there, I'm thinking, you know, areas like conscious and unconscious bias come into play, cultural preconcepts and things, and actually things that are quite a lot harder to deal with than just going, oh yes, actually we need to put that right. And it's interesting, you talk about governmental and political systems. As you'll be aware, some will be aware, that's a whole different thread area. And since we started doing that a couple of shows ago, we keep bumping into how it bumps into areas like this, and that happens again.
Yeah.
So just as a round off between us, and then we'll try and we're running deeply over time, which is why Nikki's had to run off. But just as a round off between us, and we'll try and get a couple of questions in if people want to. There's a prompt for anybody who's wanting to ask a question in a moment. But we've got the South Gloucestershire show coming up on the 8th and 9th of November, and we'll be running an EDI forum. We'll be running some of the other environment forums. We will be running environmental forum. That's not what I meant to say. Some of the other forums and discussions around, you know, emotional intelligence and mental health. Do you see any? Is it too early, or have you in your mind got a format for what's going to be on that radar in Bristol in November?
Yeah, so one of the things that's come up as being the area that's had least movement. So one of the ways I normally start the debates is, so what's had the most movement in the last, you know, the most light shone on it, if you like, in the last couple of years, and what's had the least. And so I think the neurodiversity angle has had a lot of light shone on it. The gender angles had quite a lot of light shone on it as well. And one of the least, in fact, every time it comes out as the bottom of the pile, I'm going to be tackling single-handedly tackling ageism there. But this is going to take a little bit of forethought, I think, because I want to. There are some people around about in that area which I think would be really useful to get in.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think
debate on this. And I'm for our over 50s, you know, so I'm going to really go for it, I think, is the answer.
And apologies, your internet's breaking up a little bit.
Let's do it.
I occasionally keep jumping in because I think you finished speaking, and then I suddenly realise all that's happened is frozen. So I apologise if I'm talking over you.
That's fine.
No, I think that's great. And ageism, well, watch out for that in November. And I'm quite certain that you and I and Nikki will have a few conversations between now and November about who and how. And I think that's quite exciting. Okay, so literally we need to wrap up, but let's just have a couple of minutes. Has anybody, if you've got any questions or anything you want to shed on light on this, let's use the old-fashioned thing and put your hand up physically so we can actually see you on screen. I know Guy wants to go, so Guy, you kick it off, and everybody wants to join in, put your hand up. Guy.
Okay, one thing, going back to the race relations side parliamentarily, there's a fascinating fact that does give you where this country is. The first Race Relations Act was introduced in 1965. Homosexuality was only made legal in 1966. These are the steps. When I tell my 12-year-old daughter that these have both happened in my lifetime, she's just gobsmacked. She goes, "Really?" Yeah, so that's
absolutely.
Yeah, that's the first thing. So you've got to look at the genealogy of everything and where we've come from, and also not blame history too much. Second thing is, I think there's an awful lot with the age gap and everything, of not being able to see things without going into a lot of research on them. As for instance, I was having a discussion with two of my kids last night about Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and Cardi B. Okay, look those three up for anyone who doesn't know them and start to look at the arguments amongst them, because they are totally different. And they were both coming from different sides of the argument. Just the third thing I'd say about cultures and how to treat people and everything like that, there's a wonderful phrase that I've known for years and years by Walt Whitman, which has recently been made really famous by Ted Lasso, which is be curious, not judgmental.
Yeah.
Ask questions, ask people about things, because that's the way you learn, by asking. You learned that in school, by asking, by asking questions. If you're constantly being judgmental, you are then going to be stereotyping, conscious bias, unconscious bias, all of that.
Brilliant. And in the last minute, does anyone else have anything they want to put in? Or Sharon, do you want to come back on that? Or has anyone else got anything they'd like to lob in?
One of the things I would say, coming from South Devon, a place sort of in the 70s and 80s, where I would honestly say that everybody there was white, pretty much. Almost 100% white. If you want to challenge yourself, is to go and sit with people that aren't necessarily your normal group. Just spend some time. One of the wonderful things with being on council at ACCA is that we come from so many different countries and so many different cultures, and to watch what happens to some of them when they come to London, for example, for a conference, and how they're treated slightly differently at the hotel or whatever, and it becomes a personal thing on you, because you're like, how can you do that to my friend? Different, I think, when you're looking at a theoretical debate around, this obviously, as a liberal leaning sort of educated woman, I can appreciate that this is wrong. But then when you see it actually played out and it's people that you care for, then that is a very different situation. And I think that one of the things we can all do is to sit with other groups, try and broaden our friendships with other groups, and it becomes personal. So not only do you notice it more, but I think you're more likely to modify your own behaviours, because we all get things from the past that just come out and you're like, oh, that probably wasn't right. But I think the broader our friendship groups, then which is why things like this is a wonderful idea, but the broader our friendship groups, I think the less of this will continue.
Brilliant. Sharon, thank you so much. And I think having run over time, I think the time is now to call that one, but you'll be able to revisit this if anybody wants to on video a bit later on. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
Guy, back to you.